And that's where we are after 10 years. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about and fight with me over. And I think I've probably got a couple minutes left. Huh?
Even longer.
Even longer? So what would real leadership look like? Again, I talked about the example of the RSA conference of Bill Gates. I mean, look, Bill Gates belongs on the cover of Time magazine for understanding there's a problem, for understanding the social problems and the problems of the issues surrounding the millennial goals and other things. But he doesn't belong keynoting a security conference for 3 years in a row. There's something wrong with that picture. Another example is what happens in the security within the corporate world. We throw around terms like risk, and we talked about Entity X. Real leadership in the corporate boardroom is saying to your general counsel, I think you got to expand your understanding of what liability is. These guys are talking about something that you did not cover, in law school. You have to expand your idea of what liability is, and quite frankly, you have to expand your idea of what risk is beyond legal liability in civil matters. And an example of leadership in the government, whether or not we should have had a Homeland Security Department is one question. Whether or not it was organized properly is another question. But any spectrum of threats in the 21st century that doesn't somehow acknowledge that cybersecurity is one of the fingers on the first hand you use to start counting, not the first one, but it's up there, is a flawed national security policy. And it doesn't matter if that person's sitting in the White House or that person's sitting in DHS or wherever. But that person, for a large part of the person wasn't even sitting there. The position wasn't even filled. And again, it's not a question of ideology or it's about understanding the world that we're living in and how to react to it on a personal level. These are personal choices that people make. And so each area you can go through and you can see where decisions are made by people that will change the course of events, even though the technical answers may be there, the organizational answers may be there. If the will isn't there, if the clarity of mind isn't there, it's not going to get done. So that's why I began with the human factor and I end with the human factor. Now I've gone 1 minute over.
So I'll lead with an observation that we have so many people who don't get flu shots, don't wear seatbelts,
right,
continue to smoke,
exactly,
and other kinds of risky behavior when they should know better. I mean, even among the college population, free or almost free flu shots, and the majority don't get them. The amount of smoking that occurs on a college campus is astonishing, and we know what kind. We got all upset over 3,000 people, a little over 2,000 people in 9/11, and 644,000 a year die in the U.S. from cigarette smoking.
Yeah.
So there's a fundamental problem of psychology, not only at the top, yes, but all the way down.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Leadership in one's personal life too. Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because in awareness and education, that's one of the things I'm trying to switch on in people is. When we design awareness and education programs for a large organization, I talk about home PC security or child safety online, and they say, well, what are you talking about that for? That has nothing to do with it. I said, don't you, if you can make them understand how it affects them personally, it's the same issues. And and it's like the old thing from the Peace Corps, if you give somebody a fish, they can either eat it or it'll rot before they cook it. Or if you give them a fishing pole. If you can show people how to think about risk and crisis in their own lives, then you change it. That's the big thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Sir, we have a question in Bloomington. So you mentioned, or you spoke a little bit about the way that businesses calculate risk in hack attacks, and one of the examples you gave was the $280 million that companies stated that Kevin Mitnick did.
Yeah, it was a provocative inclusion, but yes, I did.
And $80 million of this $280 million estimate included the money that Sun spent to purchase the Solaris operating system from AT&T, which they then did not. They did not mention this in their IRS filing for the year, or did not disclose this as a loss to their shareholders. So how can we expect companies to provide accurate loss information in regard to hack attacks? What can we do as a profession, or what can we ask our legislators to do to try and get this accurate information out of them, given their tendency to sort of throw large numbers around?
Well, that's a great question, and you've brought up there are a lot of fascinating things about that particular figure, that Mitnick case figure. I think the biggest number in that whole loss total was market share, some kind of loss of market share, if I remember properly, which is an interesting thing. How to get them to do it? That's a huge question. The other huge question is how to quantify it. I think we could actually provide tools to quantify things if the funding was there for the research and people were willing to participate in government and industry. That would be there. But how to get them to do it is a tricky thing. I have to point to Sarbanes-Oxley as an example. I don't know how many people have experience with that, but just off the top of my head, I would guess a lot more money has been earned selling consulting on becoming Sarbanes-Oxley compliant than has been spent evaluating or holding people to the fire for not being Sarbanes-Oxley compliant. You know what I mean? So we live in a world now where I used to say, people don't like to hear this, but the reason you have lights when you come into a room most of the time, and the reason you have a dial tone when you pick up the phone most of the time, is because we have regulation. But I used to say that, because now it doesn't matter if you have regulations or not. Sometimes, because if you have a regulation and you don't have a regulator who's going to enforce the regulation, then you might, the regulation isn't the answer either. So we have some systemic problems. And I don't know how much security professionals can frankly do about it, because generally speaking, if you persist too far, you'll basically soon be an independent consultant somewhere. I know situations in the corporate world where, remember the summer it was Slammer, and there was like 5 of them one summer a few years ago. 5 worms, 3 or 4 worms at once within a few weeks of each other. I said, this is fantastic. Don't you? And this particular entity was hit by all of these worms in one way or another throughout the world. You could actually write a paper quantifying what happened. Because you had networks disrupted, you had people who lost data, you had to clean systems out, you had to bring systems in. You could actually put numbers on this. Imagine how useful this would be. Well, do you think that paper do you think that research ever got written? No, because everybody was too busy. But the reality is, you give them that information, you give the boardroom that information, what do they do with this? Do we have to put this on our report this year? Do we have to tell the SEC about this? Do we have to tell our shareholders about what happens at the, these are very serious problems. And I don't know, Doctor? Nothing.
Well, I mean, the fundamental problem is that to quantify losses that occurred makes them look like they were negligent.
Right.
And they simply don't want to do that. Right. That's the same reason right now why we're getting pushback on replacing voting machines.